The speaker of the hour is our brother Chuck Northop. Chuck and his wife Jody have been married for over 40 years, and together they have 4 children and 10 grandchildren. He graduated from the Preston Road School of Preaching in Dallas, Texas, under the direction of Eldred Stevens. He has labored in local work in Texas, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. He has worked in seven foreign countries: Latvia, Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, Zambia, Costa Rica, Jamaica, and he has been laboring with the School of Preaching since 1988. He presently serves as an instructor of the Bible Institute of Missouri in Springfield, Missouri, and the Online Academy of Biblical Studies, and preaches by appointment. Chuck has the topic of the challenge not to be troubled by world events.
It is wonderful to be here every year and to be a part of this congregation and to be a part of this lectureship. I've attended most of the lectures over the years, and it's always a highlight of the year. It's a highlight in a number of different ways. Highlight to hear the lessons that are proclaimed and to be strengthened by those lessons that's taught, but also the brothers that get together, and I always look forward to seeing the various ones and the various friendships. Sometimes these lectureships are the only time we get to see each other, and it's great to be able to be around each other and to be able to encourage one another. And obviously, I've been strengthened numerous times by it. I've been down and in the dumps about various things at different times, and I always just appreciate being here and being strengthened and uplifted by the proclamation of the gospel and by our friendship and our brotherhood. But also we want to express our appreciation to the church here and the oversight of this lectureship. I think this is number 43, if I remember correctly. My memory doesn't, sometimes it has short circuits in it. But nonetheless, I do appreciate this congregation and have had a working relationship with them for a number of years. And I appreciate the lessons that have gone before and the lessons that will be after. And as you well know, not all the lessons are of the same par, but all the lessons are lessons that we can learn something from. Sometimes we have to look past some different aspects of various deliveries, but there's not a single lesson that we cannot learn from. And I really do appreciate the men that stand in this pulpit and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. But we don't want to overlook the ladies downstairs and the meals that they provide for us year after year. We do appreciate them. Now, one more thing before we get, there's a couple of more things. Yesterday out in the hall, I made a challenge to a single individual, Derek. And that was, I want to hear a lesson without a sports illustration. So now the challenge is public, brother. Now one more. The Bible Institute of Missouri, of course, that's who I teach for during the week. I do teach on the weekend with the Online Academy of Biblical Studies, so I actually am an instructor in 2 different schools. But the Bible Institute of Missouri has had a really good intake of students this year. And we've had 6 students that have applied and are attending, or 5 of the 6 are attending. One was diagnosed with lymphoma just a few weeks before he came, and he's actually in Memphis, but he wants to continue his studies. But of those different students that we have, and which is one of the best intakes that we've had, but these students can't live on nothing. Now, I always think about, I gave a report one time in another town in Missouri, and this fellow came up to me afterwards and he said, if you really believe in the work you're doing, you'd do it for nothing. And it's one of those occasions where you're glad you don't have a television on your set to tell your thoughts, in your head to tell your thoughts. Well, I'm thinking, how can I do that? It's not possible for me to live on nothing. I've got to have something come in. I've got a house payment like everybody, and a car payment, and I'll have to pay the gas bill and electric bill, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how can it be? And if I got me a job, and that's not to say that preaching's not, or Bible teaching at the Bible school in Missouri is not. But if I got me a job, then I would have to, I'd have to cut down the hours that I could be teaching in school. So, it's just really not a fair statement or a fair evaluation. Well, the same thing could be said with the students. Our students, they have to put in a lot of time, and they don't have time for a part-time job. Now, we've had some that have tried, but they're just simply not able to do it. And we need the support of brethren with that. And we have 5 students that are needing support, and if you can help in any way, Brother Jerry Sollins, who is the director of the school, he's sitting in the back there, and you can talk to him, or you can ask me about it, and I'll direct you over to Jerry. And if you could help in any way, we would really appreciate it. We live in a lawless society, and I know that doesn't really shock anybody. We live in a lawless society. Months ago, I decided when I preached this lesson, I would take one day and look at my favorite news app and just point out some different things that have taken place. And this past Saturday, I decided to do that. I actually looked at it on Sunday, and I looked at it again yesterday just to see if I wanted to change a few things. But I decided, no, I'll just stick with Saturday. On Saturday alone, Al-Qaeda's terrorist activities continue. The police ambush in Philadelphia of some police officers. A body of a woman from Michigan was found on the roof of a building. A woman was gang raped over in close to the Eiffel Tower. Early morning shootings in Orlando. A gun reported and actually found a rifle on a man that tried to sneak into a Denver hospital, and the whole medical facility was shut down. Fort Worth police were also assaulted, and officers being shot. Now, that was the news in one day. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's a little bit troubling, a little bit disturbing. But as we think about that, I know that they were not troubled like Lot was troubled. You remember in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7, the Bible says that Lot vexed his soul by the Sodomites. And so Lot was troubled by the things that had taken place within the world. Well, then we get to our text of Matthew the 13th chapter, and we can just picture Jesus walking out of the temple. And the disciples, various ones, said to Jesus concerning the architecture and the building that had been built. And I don't know about you, I appreciate good architecture, and I like to look at the craftsmanship within buildings, and they probably were doing something like that. And Jesus said to them that there would be not one stone left upon another. Well, as they went out of the temple, the disciples came to him and asked a question. And because of Mark's account, we know who those disciples were. It was Peter, James, and John, and Andrew. And they asked him really 2 basic questions. The first question was, when shall these things be? And the second question, what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? Now, because of Matthew's account, the second question really concerned the second coming of Christ. And we know the first account deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. But that destruction and that activity of the conflict that existed in Palestine at that time was not new to them. I mean, just think about it, just a few hundred years before, and the battles that took place between the Maccabees and the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire made finally a conquest of that region. But the conflict continued on. And in fact, of the 12 apostles, one was a tax collector, Matthew, and one was a zealot. Well, a zealot was a follower of the Maccabees, and they opposed the Roman Empire. A tax collector collected taxes for the Roman Empire. And so just by themselves shows the clash that would have taken place. Of course, we know that under the graceful and merciful hand of Jesus, that political conflict is taken out of the way. But nonetheless, they asked that question, or those questions. In answer to those questions, Jesus spent some time in dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he spent some time with the second coming. And all four synoptic gospel accounts, or all three synoptic gospel accounts, deal with it. The parallel is Matthew the 24th chapter and Luke the 21st chapter. Now, Jesus then answers that question concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. But he gave us some principles that we can apply to our lives that will challenge us to have the proper kind of life in respect to the world events. So our purpose is to examine these particular principles in order for us to live our lives in this troubling world. Now let's go to our text in Mark chapter 13 and verse 7 and 8. He says, "And when ye shall hear wars and rumors of war, ye shall be ye not troubled, for such must needs be, but the end shall not be. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and those shall be earthquakes in diverse places, and there shall be famine and trouble. These are the beginnings of sorrows." So as we look at this particular text, the first principle that we find is the principle that he said, "Be ye not troubled." Now notice the personal application there. I can't be not troubled for you, and you can't be not troubled for me, so it's a personal application. Be ye not troubled. But at the same time, we understand that we are disturbed by such things. But it's one thing to be disturbed, and it's another thing to be troubled. And the word that's particularly used here really comes out to be the outcry or the outburst that would result as being troubled. And we've all been troubled in that way. In fact, I think the best illustration that I could think of in that, many of us are old enough, we remember where we were when President John F. Kennedy was killed. It affected our lives. It affected the way we lived. It affected the time period, no doubt. Most of us remember where we were when the Challenger exploded. Did it not have an impact upon our lives? Of course it did. We probably remember where we were when the explosion took place in Oklahoma City and half that building fell and literally hundreds lost their lives. And you probably remember more recently where you were when you heard about 9/11. And having celebrated that anniversary here recently, we all remember where we were. We remember what had happened. And we remember all the different things that went along with it. You probably remember seeing that plane hit the side of that building. And you probably remember the news reports and probably remember other effects of that. And it affected our lives. But Jesus said, "Be ye not troubled." Don't let it turn into outbursts. Don't let it turn into a tumult. But be ye not troubled. But when I think about that, I can't help but think to myself, well, okay, I understand the principle. I understand what Jesus said on that particular occasion. And I understand the comfort that he was providing for the disciples based upon the wars and the rumors of war and the world events at that particular time. I understand that. But how can it be that I'm not going to be troubled? How can I not allow myself to not be troubled? Well, I think there are some really basic principles that we can learn. And the first is that we need to learn how to trust God. Now, I'm not talking about just verbiage. We've all met those people that say, well, yeah, I trust God, but then they turn around and don't do what God said. Then they turn around and they really don't live a life that shows trust in God. They really don't believe what God said. They, et cetera, et cetera. But we must trust in God. I can't help but think about old Judah or old Israel. You know, they could trust in everything but God, the very one that could save them. I mean, think about old Israel. Think about old Judah. They could trust in their wealth. They could trust in their prosperity. And they did trust in their wealth and their prosperity. But is it any different today? I mean, let's face the facts. A lot of folks, they simply trust in their houses and their wealth and their cars and their boats and all the things that they have, rather than trusting in God who could save them. Old Israel could trust in their confederations, their allegiances, and their alliances with other nations. They trusted in their alliance with Assyria, and Assyria was the very one that would bring them down. They trusted in their alliance with Babylon, and guess what? Babylon would bring down the southern kingdom. They trusted in their alliance with Egypt, and so Egypt passed through their land, went up to Carchemish, and was destroyed. Their army, Pharaoh Necho, was destroyed in his army at Carchemish. Well, they trusted in their alliances, but their alliances did not save them, and many of their alliances was the very thing that God used to bring them down. But they also trusted in their gods, the gods that Isaiah said that would tremble as the army approached. And what he was really talking about is the movement and the force of the military as they would come upon them, making the ground shake, and the idol would sit on their mantle and would shake and quiver. I mean, that's the most movement it had. And yet it could not save them. It couldn't even save itself. I mean, think about it. If there was enough movement on there, the idol would fall off the mantle. It could not save itself, let alone the people of Israel and the people of Judah. But they sure trusted in them. They trusted in their temple in Jerusalem. I mean, this is God's temple. And God's not going to allow His temple to be destroyed. That's what they thought. But it was destroyed. They trusted in everything but the person who could save them, God Almighty. What a sad state of affairs. But I don't really see it too much different today. Now, I know what it's like for soldiers to go off. Now, I did not serve in the military, but I remember men that did. And I remember being out of high school and men being drafted and taken off to Vietnam, and some did not return, some did return. I remember what it was like, and I remember when those bodies came back. I remember that. But the fact is, the military is not going to save. We can think that we have the most powerful military on earth, but was it not the case that Assyria thought the same thing? Was it not the case that Babylon thought the same thing? Was it not the case that Rome thought the same thing? And yet those nations have come and those nations have gone. No, our military strength is not what we can trust in. We must learn to trust God. God is the one that can save us, and only God can save us. But then we also ought to remember that God rules over the nations of men. In Romans 13 and verse 1, Paul, in writing to the Romans, said this about the nations, that they are a servant of God or a minister of God, and they beareth not the sword in vain. And the point that God was making is, and the same point is made in the book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 18, and also the book of Daniel, that God raises up nation and God destroys nation. He takes them away. And more than likely, we're just among those nations that God have raised up and that one day that God will destroy. God is in control of the nations. And we think about Israel, old Israel. And you remember back in the book of Genesis that God said that the iniquity of the Amorites are not yet full. He was going to use the nation of Israel to punish the nations in Palestine, and other nations besides this, but including the Amorites. But then he raised up the nation of Assyria to punish Israel, and he raised up the nation of Babylon to punish Assyria for overdoing what their punishment was of Israel, but also to punish Judah in the southern kingdom. And he raised up the Medo-Persian Empire to punish the nation of Babylon. And I suspect that he's raised up nations today, just as he did then, to punish other nations. Now, I can't imagine it being any other way myself. Since he worked that way in the Old Testament, I think he probably works that way in the New Testament. But can I say that absolutely he's raised up the United States to punish another nation, or raised up another nation to punish us? Well, it's not revealed. The secret things belong unto God. But the history shows itself that God is still in control of the nation, and Paul's exhortation is very clear that he still controls the nations. They are a minister unto him, and they serve two purposes. One purpose is to punish the evil, punish the wicked doers, and the other purpose is to uphold the arms of them that do good. Now that's what Peter said over in 1 Peter chapter 2. So it is the case that it is the truth that God raises up nations, and he uses nations to accomplish his purpose. And we must just simply rely on the fact that God still controls the nations. But then, another way that I cannot be troubled is by remembering that God still cares for his children, and he takes care of them. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be hurt in a war. It doesn't mean that we're never going to be persecuted. It doesn't mean that these things won't happen to us. In fact, as we continue on in this particular passage, he talks about those various things that would happen. But don't you find it interesting that he said to them, when you hear of such things, he said, you flee to the hills. And he protected them to some degree. Now, not all would be able to flee, because he said, woe to them that are with child. So not everybody is able to flee, and some of us will be hurt in various conflicts that take place within the world. But God still cares for me. Now, I can't help but think about the book of Philippians with reference to that. And you say, well, Chuck, how does that fit with this? Well, let me explain it. You know, when Paul wrote the book of Philippians, and we know the theme of the book is the idea of joy, and he uses the word joy and glad and rejoice a number of different times, 20-some different times within that book. But remember who were members at Philippi. There would have been Lydia there, and she would have known about what had happened to Paul and Silas. The jailer would have been there. The jailer would have remembered exactly what had taken place as far as Paul and Silas was concerned. His family would have remembered that. And yet Paul said, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. They would have understood that Paul and Silas in the inner prison in stocks, and probably the inner prison is what we would picture within our minds as a dungeon, most likely. And good possibility that they had chains and other stocks in that room, and even a good possibility there were dead men's bones in that room. And what were they doing at midnight? Singing and praying. You think God cared for them? It wasn't the outward things, it was the inward thing. And God provides for us. Yes, there may be the wars and invasions of our land, but let us not forget, God cares for us, and he gives us the inward mind and the inward spirit to be able to overcome such things. But another thing that Jesus said, and a principle that Jesus established that helps us to understand what we are talking about, is at the end of verse 7 he says, and the end shall not be yet. The question always comes up that when you look at this, what is the end there? Now, I found it very interesting when I was studying for this particular lesson. I looked at this commentary, that commentary, and other commentaries and various lectures and what they said about it. And many of those writers just simply wrote, the end is the destruction of Jerusalem, and that's all they said. And I think to myself, wait a second, you saying it doesn't prove it. I mean, give me some evidence why you think that. Well, I do think that it probably is a reference to the end of Jerusalem and the destruction that would take place as far as the temple is concerned, but let me give you a reason or two because of it. Well, you see, this is in the section that deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. That ought to tell us something. And he also said in verse 30 that all these things would take place in the lifetime of those that were present that particular day. There'd be some that would not taste of death till they see these things come to pass. So I think that indicates for us, those two pieces of evidence indicates for us that he is talking about the end of and the destruction of Jerusalem. But now we have to ask, well, okay, I understand what he's talking about as far as the end is concerned, but how is that a statement of comfort? How can I understand and be challenged to maintain an attitude of being a Christian in this present world with the present situations that we find ourselves within? Well, wars and rumors of wars doesn't make for an end. Now, I remember the 1950s, and I know Jeremy said several times in the lesson that I'm an old guy, but of us old guys, I'm one of the younger ones. Although when I was in Majuro this past summer in the Marshall Islands, the local preacher, Danny Jim, he told Russ several times, and Russ didn't tell me this until the end, but he kept telling Russ, I like that old man, talking about me. Well, so it gets toward the end, and Russ finally lets it out of the bag, and Danny says, well, Chuck, just how old are you? And I told him, and he said, well, the average lifespan for a man is less than 60 years here in the Marshall Islands. Well, then I got to looking around. I was the old man. But I'm glad to be here because a whole lot of you more older than I am. I know that's not proper English, Jerry, and you can mark it down on your paper and mark it off. I don't care. But I'll remember it the next time you preach. Well, anyway, we have to ask, well, why is it, and how is it, this idea or this statement that this is not the end, or the end shall not be yet, be a comfort to them? Well, you see, the wars and rumors of war, they just simply, that doesn't make the end. I mean, just because you hear about it. I remember growing up in the 50s and the 60s, and I remember even in junior high and high school going to those special assemblies, and the whole class would come and they'd have a movie about the atomic bomb and all the destruction that could take place, and that we're going to destroy ourselves with atomic bomb. Well, we have bombs that are greater than the atomic bomb ever thought about being, and yet we have not destroyed ourselves. And I remember, the alarmists that talked about the polluting of the world, and we're going to destroy ourselves by the pollution of the world. And I always found it interesting when we lived in Kiev, Ukraine, and one of the hardest winters that Kiev had ever had, a certain person here in the States were talking about global warming. And we're going to destroy ourselves with global warming. And the alarmists keep on, and they continue on telling us such things. But let us not forget, just because there are wars and rumors of war, it doesn't necessitate the end. In fact, when the end comes, the ultimate end, the end at the second coming, when this world will be destroyed, when it comes, God's going to do the destroying. Now, we might destroy part of ourselves, and we might destroy parts of the earth, but when the end comes, God is going to bring that end. And let us never forget. And I can find great comfort in that God is the one that's going to bring that end. So the reminder then really should encourage us and challenge us as Christians to maintain our faithfulness and stay the course. I mean, I think that's really what he's talking about there. All the warnings that we have ever received about the end of time has already been given to us. Now, we have all kinds of warnings, but it's not the warnings that many in the denominational world or the religious world are telling us. I mean, I've seen the date setters, and you've seen them as well. I remember 1975 and the date setters back then. I remember certain other events and the date setters, and they have come and gone, and the world did not come to an end, because all the warnings that we are ever going to receive are already found within the Scriptures. And He's going to come as a thief in the night. And I don't know about you, I've had my house broke into before, and you know that old sorry dog? He did not call me ahead of time. You know, they don't warn when they pull those kind of things. All the warnings that we have received have already been received, and we must maintain our faithfulness. And the disciples needed to maintain their faithfulness in the first century, like we need to maintain our faithfulness today. But also we need to be reminded that, you know, the reality is that sometimes, rather than getting upset and getting all flustered and bothered by these different matters and troubled by these matters, we just need to learn how to leave it in God's hands. There's not one thing we can do. Well, there is one thing we can do. One sister came up to me a few weeks back, and she was really upset about the political state of affairs and the different things about the United States. She had been watching too much news, and I told her, I said, you know, you'd probably be very well off to turn that tube off. Well, you know, leave it in God's hands. And sometimes we need to. Now, I'm not saying that we ought not be on top of the world events. I think we ought to, and we ought to watch the news sometimes. But we've got to turn it back to God. We've got to put it in God's hands and let God take care of some of those things. I mean, as sad as and as much as I would want to do about it, I can't change some world events. I can help with that change, but I can't change them. And I've got to accept that God is in control, that is in His hands. And we also ought to be remembered, or that we ought to remember that, well, you know, persecutions and apostasy and false teaching, they're going to continue. And whether we like it or not, and no matter how much we oppose them, they are still going to continue. Some Christian somewhere is going to be bad-mouthed because they've stood up for what's right. Somebody somewhere is going to be called goody two-shoes because, and that's what I was called one time, although I didn't really feel too bad about it. But nonetheless, that's what they called me, thinking that they were going to really hurt my feelings, I guess. But they said, goody two-shoes. Well, somebody's going to be called that. And probably somebody today has been called something like that. But so what? It's going to continue, and we're not going to change what the world does. Several years ago, now this has been a long time, Brother Jack Williams came up to the front toward the end of the lesson, just like our brother did, and Bill Goring said, "Here comes the beast." No application, just making a story. Well, so anyway, we need to remember to turn it into God, put it on God's hands, and leave it in God's hands, and that these things would continue on. The last statement that he makes that I think was a principle that he gave, and that's at the end of verse 8. He said, "These are the beginnings of sorrow." Now, because he uses the word beginning, and it is a proper translation, but I think a better word would have been, it's the word ark or arche in the Greek. Sometimes it means like the commencement, like a beginning. Sometimes it means like the greatest, like the word archangel. It actually is a transliteration, archangelos, as Brother Jeremy pointed out yesterday. And the word ark sometimes can mean a greater degree. Had the disciples been persecuted by this time? Well, yeah, they had been, very clearly. They had been. But because of the establishment of the church and because of what had taken place, the the persecution was going to grow. The word that's translated sorrow is really the word travail. It's like giving birth, the pain of childbirth. And so there's going to be a greater pain, a greater sorrow that's going to take place. And that's what we find in the book of Acts against the disciples. I remember when I was in preaching school, I decided one day that I would take the book of Acts and highlight all the different places or underline all the different places that dealt with persecution. After I got through chapter 4, I decided the whole book was going to be marked up and decided that maybe I should rethink this. Well, you see, the persecution was highlighted during that time, and you say, well, okay, I understand that, but what's the encouragement here that I can live this good life in these world events and in light of these world events? Well, you know, look at the very next verse. He said, take heed to yourself. In other words, pay attention to yourself. Yes, these things are going to happen. It's going to be an heightened persecution, but you pay attention to yourself. And then notice also verse 19. He talks about persecution. Don't be distracted by persecution. You just maintain your faithfulness. You keep watching on yourself, and no matter what anybody else does, you maintain your faithfulness. Don't get out of focus because of the world events. You maintain that. Notice the very next verse. And I realize he talks about the gospel in a different way that we would talk about it today, because the gospel hadn't been preached in its fruition. The church had not been established. But we have a responsibility nonetheless, just as they had a responsibility. We have the responsibility to get to work in preaching and proclaiming the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. You see, brethren, we're not going to be disturbed by the world events so much if we get out there and do the work that God has called upon us to do, and get busy in that work, and not allow the world events to distract us from that work. Yes, we might have to change our location. We might have to do a little bit something different in order to avoid certain places in the world, but nonetheless, we have a responsibility to get back to that work and be involved in the work of the spreading of the gospel. And then notice verse 13. He said, endure to the end. Brethren, we must endure to the end. If we are going to be the faithful that we ought to be, we must endure to the end. No matter what the world events are, no matter what's going around about us, we must stay focused and we must endure to the end. It is easy to listen to the news and be troubled by it and disturbed by it, and we get distracted by the world events that we forget what our real job is. The commission that God has provided for us. Yes, we sometimes get distracted. Yes, we sometimes get out of focus. But let us get back into focus and focus upon our citizenship, which is in heaven. You see, our citizenship, hell yeah, I understand what it means to be an American. Yeah, I understand my family's been American for a long time, mighty long time. In fact, if I wanted to be a member of the Daughters of the Revolution, well, not the daughters, but the Sons of the Revolution, I could be a member of that group, because I can prove my ancestry back to the Revolutionary War. And I've got ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War. My great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War for the United States, by the way, not upon the Southern aggression. But nonetheless, he fought for the United States, and he lost a brother. In fact, he lost a couple of brothers in that war. I know what it's like. And I remember in 1966, we'd been out camping. My family and I, just a young man, we drove into my hometown. And as you drove into my hometown, the first thing you would do is cross railroad tracks on the west side of town. And there was a street that went right beside those railroad tracks. And we turned around that corner, and there was an olive green car sitting there, military vehicle. And when we went by that car, that car pulled in behind us and followed us to the house. And he announced to my dad that his brother had been killed in Vietnam. I remember it well. I know what it's like to be an American. I appreciate the freedoms that we have as an American. But my citizenship is in heaven. My citizenship is somewhere else. As much as I appreciate the American freedoms that I have, my citizenship is a whole lot better than that. As much as I appreciate the United States, my citizenship in heaven is eternal. My citizenship on earth is just temporal. And it's going to be taken away one day. I'm quite confident of that. But my citizenship in heaven will not be taken away by man. And so let us be the citizens that we ought to be and not be caught up too much in the world events, but be the citizen working and doing the job that citizens of the kingdom of God have. Thank you very much.